Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's February 23rd, 2022, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're taking a look at two bioacoustic studies of African wildlife, and we take a listen to some of the recordings informing that research. As regular listeners to the Manga Bay Newscast will know, we frequently feature bioacoustic recordings on this podcast. Bioacoustics combines biology and acoustics, or in other words, it's the study of the sounds animals make, which can tell us a lot about animal behavior, population dynamics, how species are responding to pressures like habitat destruction or global warming, and much, much more. Bioacoustics is a rapidly growing field of study and is being used to gather data on a wide variety of wildlife right now. But according to a recent study published in the journal Bioacoustics, there is considerable room to expand bioacoustic research on the African continent, one of the most biodiverse regions on planet Earth. You can find a link to that study, Becker et al. 2022, in the show notes for this episode. The researchers found that nearly 70% of the bioacoustic studies done in Africa focused on animal behavior, and that the vast majority were particularly focused on the behavior of terrestrial mammal species. So on today's episode of the Manga Bay Newscast, we're taking a look at bioacoustic studies of semi-aquatic and marine mammal species. Our first guest today is Nicolas Mathevon, a professor at the University of Saint-Étienne in France, who co-authored a report published in Current Biology magazine last month that summarized the results of a study that found vocal recognition is used by hippos to manage relationships between territorial groups. Mathevon tells us about the study of vocal recognition in hippos, plays us some of the hippo calls used in the study, and tells us how the study's findings could help improve conservation measures like translocations. We also speak today with Clinton Factheu, a PhD student at the University of Yaoundé 1 in Cameroon and a research assistant with the African Marine Mammal Conservation Organization. Factheu recently co-authored a study published by the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America that used passive acoustic monitoring to provide the first characterization of African manatee vocalizations. He tells us about that research and why bioacoustic monitoring is one of the best ways to study a marine mammal like the manatee. He also plays a number of manatee calls for us.
Bioacoustics is a growing domain in Africa, especially in aquatic wildlife. So we need more training sessions, more equipment and funding, because aquatic research is very costly, and we need funding, training sessions, and equipment to further understand aquatic wildlife.
According to Nicolas Mathevon and his co-authors on the recent Current Biology article summarizing their hippo research, it's becoming increasingly difficult for large mammals like hippos to inhabit planet Earth. The more we know about a species' biology, they write, the better we can design effective conservation measures. Yet very little is known about hippos' social communication, even though they are one of the three iconic mega-herbivore species of Africa, together with elephants and rhinos. Mathevon says that the study he and his colleagues undertook not only seeks to address this gap in our knowledge of hippo communication, but might even help improve the success of translocations of the animals.
I'm a bioacoustician, and I did this study with other bioacoustician colleagues, so especially Paulo Fonseca from the University of Lisbon. And as bioacousticians, we are really interested in understanding how animals exchange information using sounds and using vocalizations. And the hippo is a very interesting model because it's a social animal, so it lives in groups, and the hippo has a very big vocal repertoire. This animal can emit a bunch of different types of calls, and these calls, of course, they are used to support social relationships. There have been some previous studies with hippos, so some people had already recorded vocalizations made by hippos, and there have been some studies in captivity. But up to now, there have been almost no studies using playback experiments and really trying to decipher what's the meaning of the calls that hippos produce. And so it was our first, idea was to try to start to understand the acoustic communication signals used by the hippos. So, hippos are very big animals. They are semi-aquatic, so they spend half of their life, I would say, in the water, because during the day they stay in water, because they really they have problems with the sun, and their skin is very, very sensitive. And when they are in water, they are in groups that are called pods, and in these pods you have males, females, and young, and all these individuals they call from time to time. And during the night, they go out the water and they feed out of the water. They are terrestrial animal when they feed. And so our first idea was to say, okay, in the same lakes, so in the place where we did the study, it was in Maputo Special Reserve in Mozambique. In this place, you have very big lakes, and in these lakes, you have several pods of hippos that are separated by a few hundred meters. And it is said that hippos are very territorial, that they defend the territory. So in each pod, you have some dominant animals that can be very aggressive. And we wanted to test this hypothesis that maybe the hippos, they know each other by voice. Maybe they were able to recognize the individuals of their group. And maybe they were able also to recognize individuals from a familiar group, a group from the same lake. And so we decided to set up this playback experiment to ask the question to the animal: are you able to identify an individual that belongs to your group, or to recognize an individual that is familiar versus an individual that you have never heard?
So tell us about how you actually conducted this study. You mentioned it was a playback study. So you actually set up speakers and played back the calls of hippos from the same pods, from neighboring pods, and from complete strangers?
So first of all, you have to realize that it's not easy to work with these animals. These animals are very dangerous. They attack humans, and in Africa, each year they kill a lot of people, especially fishermen. So you have to be very cautious with these animals. So to do our study, the first step was to get recordings. So firstly, we recorded several animals from different groups, and when we have all the signals, then we did the playback experiments. So the playback experiments were set up as follows. So we had a very big loudspeaker, because to mimic the voice of a hippopotamus, you have to use a big loudspeaker, a very powerful one. And with this loudspeaker that was placed on the bank and not in the water, on the edge of the lake, we played back different types of signals. Not all the signals at the same time, of course. During the first experiment, for instance, the first trial, we emitted the call of a familiar individual. So that is to say, an individual that has been recorded from another group, but on the same lake. And the day after, or 2 days after, we came back to the same pod and we play back the voice of one individual of the pod. So really an individual that is present in the pod that we tested. And on another day, we tested the same pod with the voice of a totally unknown animal that we recorded on another lake. And that was the principle of the experiment. And of course, we did this again on several pods to replicate the experiments and to see if there was a statistical, power in the results. So that was the idea. And then during the playback experiment, so how does it go? So we emitted the calls through the loudspeaker. So just a few of them. It's a very short signal. So something like that's the call of a hippo. So we just emitted that, and then we observed and we also video recorded the behavioral reaction of the hippos. What were the behavioral reaction of the hippos? So either it was a very small reaction, just a few calls back, And this is typically what hippos do when one of the member of the group is calling, so they respond to each other. But when the hippos heard the calls from a stranger individual, an individual that they do not know, then the behavioral reaction could be very, very strong. And so it was calls, but the hippos also approached to the loudspeaker. And even we also observed very often a marking behavior. So in that case, the hippo, and especially the most dominant individual in the group, approaches the loudspeaker and sprays dung everywhere. And also it can open the mouth and so display a very, very aggressive behavior.
And we have some hippo calls to listen to. Are these actually calls that you used as part of the playback experiments?
Yes, exactly. So these calls, they are Wheeze honks. So these calls are the most common calls of the hippos. They can emit many different other calls, but this is the most common. It's kind of contact call, if you want to call it. And what you have in the recordings, that you have three different calls, and those calls they are from three different individuals. And it's very easy, even with our human ears, to catch the individual differences between the calls. They really sound differently. It's because they are from different individuals. So there is an individual vocal signature in these with honks. Our study does not, how to say, we don't have the real evidence that the hippos, they recognize individual voices. What we have shown is that they are able to distinguish between familiar individuals from their group, and unknown individuals. But there is good indications that indeed they are able to recognize each individual using their voice. And this is something that is quite common in the animal world. We have, I participated to other studies, for instance, in the elephant seal, in the northern elephant seal, and here all the males, they know each other by their voice.
Okay, well, let's listen to these three different recordings so we can hear these individualized calls for ourselves. All of these are what's known as wheeze honks, as Nicolas mentioned. Here's the first one, and I'm going to loop this a couple times so you can give it a good listen. Here's the second hippo's wheeze honk. And here's the third. So, Nicolas, in the current biology piece about your research, you and your colleagues mentioned that this kind of playback of hippo calls might help make translocations of the animals more successful by familiarizing the hippos with each other. Can you talk about the conservation implications of your findings?
Yes. So that was just an idea, because we did not test it, of course. We did not participate in a hippo relocation. So I really don't know if it would work. But my guess is that if at one stage conservationists want to relocate individuals, which can happen because you have a lot of human hippo conflicts in several areas, because as I was telling you, these animals are really dangerous. So it might happen that at one stage people want to relocate animals in other places. And what we think now that we've done this study is that maybe it would be a good idea to get the local hippos used to the voice of the new ones before they arrive, and vice versa. So, of course, I'm not saying that this measure will be sufficient to suppress all aggression, since, other sensory signals like chemical cues or even visual cues are certainly also involved in a hippo communications. But it may help. So we could imagine that before translocating hippos or a group of hippos, we played back their signals, their calls from a certain distance to the groups that are already in the area. And then progressively, these groups, they will habituate to the presence of these new ones. Because this is something that is quite usual in territorial animals, is that the territorial animals, they become progressively tolerant to their neighbors. Because their neighbors, they are there and they don't attack them. And so they get used to them, and progressively they lose their aggressiveness towards their neighbors. This is something that has been described a long time ago with territorial songbirds. It's very well known. So now we have the evidence that it also exists in hippos. And so maybe this possibility of getting habituated to the voice of your neighbors could be of help in the case of hippos, and maybe could be of interest for conservation.
Do you plan to study this, whether or not playback of hippo calls can aid in translocations?
No, because we are really not involved in this conservation things. But what we are going now to investigate, first we are going to investigate more all the acoustic communication of the hippos, because what we would like to know, for instance, that when they go feeding during the night, so when they are outside the water, how do they react to the voice of familiar versus stranger individuals? Because our guess is that they are more tolerant outside water. So this animal is very unknown. There is not a lot of knowledge about their behavioral biology. And so if people want to set up informed conservation plans, they really have to get some more knowledge about their behavioral biology. And the other thing that we want also to investigate, and we are going to Mozambique in a few weeks to start this project, is to see the importance, is to test the importance of chemical communications, and really want to see if, as they use this dung spraying behavior to mark their territory, is odor an important factor in modulating their behavioral reaction to sound signals.
What is the conservation status of hippos, and why is it important for us to have a better understanding of their behavior?
So now hippos are big mammals. So they are called they are part of the mega herbivores, like the elephants, the rhinos, and so they have a huge impact on African ecosystems. And the populations of rhinos is quite fluctuating. It was dropping. Now it's a little bit stabilizing. It really depends on the area. And so they play a big role, and a very important role in their ecosystem, because they are big. So they feed outside the water. They import nutriments in the water, because then they stay during the day. They spread their dung in the water, etc. So they really have a huge impact on the ecosystems. And so they are important animals. And the other thing is that these animals are dangerous. They are big, so they are in competition with humans. They can represent a threat to humans. So these human-hippo conflicts are really to be managed. And it's not an easy thing. I would say in the old ages, people used to kill the animals and things like this. Now, other methods and other way of managing human-animal relationships are fortunately used, but still it's a difficult thing. And as these animals are very difficult to study, because, for instance, they are very difficult to mark. It's very difficult to identify each individual in the group. Several people have tried to mark them with different tags, with color, etc. And up to now, nobody really succeeded. So it's difficult to follow, to track the animals individually. And for instance, up to now, we don't really know a lot about their social system. We think that it's what we call a fission social system, where animals they form group during the day, and then they go outside during the night, and they mix with other group, and maybe in the day the animals they join other groups that they were the day before. Nothing is very clear about that. It also depends on the availability of water, on the level of water in the lakes, etc. So we really need people that observe these animals on the long term, and we really need to gather more information about their behavior to take informed decision, I would say. And we are not the only people to perform studies on the hippos, and especially there are some people involved in ecological studies that try to understand the ecological impact in terms, for instance, of nutrient transfers in the ecosystems that study hippos.
One of the things we don't really know about hippos is whether or not they vocalize underwater, right? When we were arranging this interview, you mentioned that it's a common misconception that hippos call underwater, but that we really don't have evidence for that. Is that right?
Yeah. So if you go to the literature, you will find evidence. But we are not, with my colleague Paolo, now we are not really sure that this underwater acoustic communication are really important. You know, the fact is that sounds can propagate very well underwater, but to propagate very well, you have to have a certain depth of water. And the hippos, most of the time, they are in the lakes where the depth of the water is not very large. So the places where you don't have a lot of water, and then the sounds there, they cannot propagate on a very long distance. So what we think is that maybe within a group, so when the hippos are very, very close together, yes, it's possible that underwater sounds can be emitted and transmitted between individuals. But we don't think, but it remains to be really tested, but we don't think that these acoustic signals will propagate, for instance, at several hundred meters and could support intergroup communication. We don't think it's possible. And you know, these vocalizations that the hippos emit, they are aerial vocalizations. So they are vocalizations that are basically produced to transmit in air. So yeah, I won't be, too much affirmative, because I think that many other studies are needed to test whether hippos can really use underwater acoustic communication. But I'm not very confident that the results will be good. I'm really thinking that the hippos they mostly use aerial acoustic communication, and the underwater sound is just a byproduct of the fact that these animals, when they call, they are almost totally immersed.
I mentioned at the start of this show that a study assessing the bioacoustics literature from Africa found a strong bias towards studying the behavior of terrestrial mammals. That study also found that the literature is skewed towards Eastern and Southern Africa and non-African authors. But as bioacoustic research expands across the African continent, these biases might be becoming less of a factor. Our next guest, for instance, Clinton Factheu, is working on a PhD at the University of Yaoundé 1 in the Central African nation of Cameroon, and he's using bioacoustics to study the African manatee. A study he co-authored, which we will of course link to in the show notes for this episode along with all the other studies we're discussing today, provides the first characterization of the vocalization of these marine mammals.
The African manatee is one of the 4 sirenian species. Sirenian generally are very understudied, and African manatee within this understudied species is the least studied sirenian and the least studied large mammal in Africa. So very little is known about the species, nothing about its gestation period, about the mother-calf pregnancy period. So in addition to all of that, African manatees are very elusive and cryptic, very difficult to visually study. So we were thinking of using a new tool, passive acoustics, that could provide much better information remotely about the species. That's how we we decided to deploy hydrophones in what is known as African Manatee Sanctuary in Cameroon, Lake Osa, to record Manatee vocalizations, to know if we could record it, first of all, knowing manatees, African manatees, might vocalize just like the other Sirenian species. So yeah, we got manatee, African manatee vocalizations, and there was nothing new about the vocalization. So we had to do a first characterization of the vocalization before trying to use the tool to study the species using passive acoustics.
Can you tell us a little bit more about where and when the study was conducted and just how you conducted it using hydrophones?
The study was conducted here in Cameroon at Lake Osa. As I said, Lake Osa is known as African Manatee Sanctuary in Cameroon due to its relative high abundance with regard to other manatee habitats in Cameroon. So yeah, we deployed a hydrophone, LS1 hydrophone at the entrance of Lake Osa, and we did 2-3 days deployments. Afterward, in April 2020, afterward we withdrew the hydrophones and inspected the recordings to search for manatee vocalizations.
And the purpose of the study was to characterize their vocalizations as opposed to, say, learning more about their behavior or social interactions?
Yeah, the purpose of the study was, first of all, to know if African manatee vocalize in the wild, because it is the first time that we got African manatee vocalizations in the wild. We got the first recordings of African manatee vocalizations were done in the 1980s by O'Shea. But it was in unnatural circumstances. It was an orphan calf that was scared before being released. So we didn't know that African manatees could vocalize in the wild in their natural habitat. So the first information to gather was to know if African manatee vocalize in the wild. Yes, that was done. Now, could their vocalization be used to monitor them? That's also yes. The answer is yes. And 3, how do their vocalizations look like in comparison to other manatee species? So that's how we did the characterization, and the conclusion was that the African manatee vocalizations are very alike to other manatee species.
We, of course, have some manatee calls to play for our listeners today. It's actually a minute-long compilation of different calls that you recorded as part of the study. Can you tell us what we'll be hearing in this compilation?
Most of the vocalizations we get are high-pitched squeaks, because manatees have basically 3 to 5 call types, depending on authors. We have squeaks, squeals, screeches, whines, and I said squeaks already. Yeah, so we have squeaks, screeches, whines, and squeals. So the most of the vocalizations we hear now are squeaks.
Okay, here is that minute-long compilation of African manatee vocalizations. So, Clinton, you had mentioned that manatees are a somewhat elusive species and it's hard to monitor them visually. So that makes bioacoustics a particularly good way to learn about them and monitor them?
Yeah. Within the 2-3 days deployment we did in Lake Osa, we registered manatee vocalization each single day. So manatees were detected every day. And when you visually scan for manatees at Lake Osa, you might get manatees, you might visually spot manatees maybe once every 10 times, which is a very low ratio. So yes, indeed, passive acoustics are a great tool, a very promising tool to monitor the African manatee. And it is also one of the objectives of my PhD thesis. I use passive acoustics to monitor African manatees in Lake Osa, and I also compare passive acoustics to other manatee detection methods, including point scan, which is visually scanning the water surface, and a sonar scan, using a 360 sonar scan to scan underwater, search for manatees. Yeah, the work is still ongoing, but preliminary results show that passive acoustics are indeed more efficient in detecting African manatees in Lake Osa.
What's the conservation status of the African manatee, and is one of the goals of your work to learn more about them in order to better design conservation measures?
We study African manatees to, first of all, better know them, because you cannot conserve a species that you don't understand its ecology and its ethology. So we needed to provide more information about the species in order to better organize conservation strategies. So the African manatee is a vulnerable species. It's classified as vulnerable in the IUCN Red List, and classified in Appendix 1 of both the CITES and the CMS. So yeah, and under Cameroon law, African manatee are categorized in the class A animals, protected animals, which means animals that are fully protected. So yeah, the African manatee is pretty endangered and protected under various protection laws, be it nationally or internationally.
And so was this study just a first step? In other words, are you planning further research to build off what you learned about African manatee vocalizations from this study?
Yeah, we first needed to characterize, now that we have a basis. We know now how African manatee vocalizations look like. The next steps will be okay, is there a geographical variation in African manatee vocalizations? That's why we are trying to collect African manatee vocalization recordings throughout its geographic range, because African manatee has a very wide geographic range all over throughout the African Atlantic coast, from southern Mauritania to central Angola. So we will look like the next step will be collecting recordings throughout the geographic range and look if there is similarity in the vocalizations or dissimilarity. And the second step will be trying to mount a manatee detection software, autonomous manatee vocalization detection software, because the major hindrance to passive acoustics is the time that is needed to analyze recordings. It is very tedious. It takes a lot of time. So we are now planning to provide a software that will detect African manatee we detect manatee species, every species, all manatee species vocalizations automatically. So that's the two steps. The other step I'm already executing it is to use passive acoustics to monitor remote habitats like the invaded area of Lake Osa, because in Lake Osa there is invasive aquatic plant that has covered more than 60% of the lake surface, which makes the access very difficult through boat. So it's almost impossible to monitor manatees at the invaded area. So what we do now is to use deploy recorders at that area to record for a certain time, and then we retrieve the recorder to check if there are manatee vocalizations within the recordings. If there are manatee vocalizations, that means manatees inhabit the area, manatees frequent the area. If not, that means manatees do not inhabit the area, and it has a conservation significance, meaning giant salvinia impacts manatee distribution. And that's one of the objectives of my thesis, using passive acoustics to determine the impact of giant salvinia proliferation on manatee distribution and habitat use in Lake Osa. So that's some perspectives that we have, and I'm already implementing one of them.
So obviously you're a proponent of bioacoustic research. Do you think there's a need for more bioacoustic research of Africa's wildlife? Could it work just as well elsewhere, and hence would you say it should be used more widely?
Yeah. As you know, bioacoustics is a growing domain in Africa, especially in aquatic wildlife. So yeah, we need more training sessions, more equipment and funding, because aquatic research is very costly, and we need funding, training sessions, and equipment to further understand aquatic wildlife. Generally, apart from assessing the efficiency of three detection methods, African manatee detection methods, passive acoustic, sonar scan, and point scan, visual inspection. I also, I've already told you, use passive acoustics to monitor African manatee distribution and habitat use with regard to giant Sardinia invasion in Lake Osa. I also study African manatee genetics. I'm about to do the first country range African manatee genetic analysis to look at African manatee diversity and genetic connectivity, because most of African manatee studies in Cameroon are focused just downstream the lower Sanaga River. So yeah, the genetic study I'm going to carry out is to have a global idea in country-wide idea overview of African manatee genetic diversity and connectivity.
Anyone interested in exploring bioacoustics in Africa further might be interested to know that the 3rd African Bioacoustics Community Conference will be taking place in Kruger National Park, South Africa's largest game reserve, from October 2nd to the 7th. You can find more information about that at the website of the African Bioacoustics community at africanbioacoustic.wix site. That's wixsite.com/AB community. If you enjoy the Manga Bay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. We are a non-profit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/mangabay to learn more and support the Manga Bay newscast. That's patreon.com/mangabay. You and your friends can join the listeners who've downloaded the Manga Bay newscast more than 250,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Manga Bay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can keep up with all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mangabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with Manga Bay on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay, or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @mangabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Manga Bay newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.